Shut In. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. The day the quarantine was announced, the only thing I could think of was Mother. Yes, behind that, the memories crept closer, shadows and dark things, not forgotten, but suppressed, the knot of fear in my belly that had been tied long ago. But more than that, more than anything, I thought of her. In the 56 years since she arrived in Britain from Turkey, not once had she spent an entire day inside. In fact, it was rare to see her spend more than a few hours indoors. When she did, she restlessly moved between rooms, pacing and shifting from one seat to the other, always inching closer to the doors, to the outside. Most often, when I went round to visit, I would find her in the garden, or sitting out on the front step, waving to children and sharing jokes with passers-by, for whom she had long been a fixture. I had lost count of the number of times I'd been told by concerned neighbours that I should make sure to get your mother inside out of the weather, and also of the times she had scolded them for sticking their noses where they weren't wanted, and speaking to me on her behalf, as if she weren't there or in full possession of her faculties. "Why you talk to him?" she would shout, in a Turkish accent still as thick as the coffee she made, despite having lived in England for over 3 decades. "I am here. I'm not stupid. You want talk, you talk to me. If I want stay outside, I stay outside. None of your damn business." She would say this with a shake of the fist and a dismissive sucking of the teeth, a gesture I had never quite managed to master, but which I admired for its expressiveness. Once you heard that sound, you were in no doubt what it meant. I must admit, however, that despite her stubborn consternation, at times I had agreed with the neighbours. Once, during a particularly harsh winter, I had found her sitting on a deck chair on the front step with a blanket of snow draped over her. Beside her was an upright electric heater that she had dragged outside and angled in such a way that it would provide some warmth and protection against the elements. The wire for this heater had been stretched clumsily through an open window. I stared at her, huddled and shivering in disbelief. Whilst I appreciated the fact that the heater was probably the only thing keeping the stubborn old bird from getting hypothermia, the threat of electrocution meant that we argued about it, and once she had finally calmed down, I made her promise not to bring the heater outside again. The next time I visited, she was sitting outside in the snow again, but she had kept her promise. This time, instead of pulling out the heater, she had smashed up a kitchen chair and built herself a fire. "There is only me here," she said when I asked why she decided to destroy the furniture. "Why do I need 6 chairs? Don't like sitting inside anyway." I suppose she did have a point. Around 5 years ago, a sympathetic few friends and I, who understood what Mother was like, had been forced to construct a 3-sided gazebo extension at the back of the house, the planning permission for which is still somewhat dubious. We built it, unbelievably, for Mother to sleep in. Over the past year, she had been plagued by nightmares about the time before, and had steadfastly refused to sleep inside the house any longer. Instead, she had taken to dragging her mattress into the back garden and sleeping outside, either on the grass, on the paving stones under the large fur blankets she assured us were used by shepherds in the fields, or under the small porch in front of the house. The building we were forced to put up was glass on 3 sides and completely open to the elements at the front. Along the back wall, we attached a network of radiators and heaters to wastefully warm that portion of the room before the heat escaped, and pulled her bed in front of it. My mother, at 76 years of age, slept in what was little more than an upmarket greenhouse with an open front. But then, that was how she liked it, and heaven help anyone who chose to tell her otherwise. Not that she had any trouble sleeping. Despite her advanced age, my mother's usual way of avoiding being shut up in the house was to be as far from it as possible. Even at 76, she would walk somewhere close to 15 miles a day, disappearing into the hills that surrounded the town and wandering for hours on end. Whilst this might sound like cause for concern, and many would worry about their elderly relatives wandering in the peaks, for her, the open expanses were where she was most safe. The practice kept her fit and meant that by the time she lay down to sleep at night, she was physically exhausted, and in the new open sleeping areas, the nightmares came less frequently. As lockdown approached, I realized more and more that this routine was going to be hard to give up. When people think of claustrophobia, they think of elevators or tiny cramped spaces that would make anyone breathe shallow breaths. My mother's claustrophobia was not like that. She didn't want to be shut in at all. She simply couldn't deal with the idea of being trapped, pinned down, or enclosed. She would often remind me that the claustro in claustrophobia referred to a bolt, as in something used to seal a lock or door, which, she would point out, was ironic because bolt was exactly what she wanted to do whenever she even thought of being caught inside. My mother had decided 56 years earlier that she never wanted to be sealed in or locked down ever again, which was a problem considering what was about to be announced. I watched the daily press conferences leading up to quarantine in the kitchen. The British Prime Minister, whose jowly, hound dog face always looked as if it was partway through losing a battle with gravity anyway, looked even more sullen than usual as he spoke in direct terms through frowns and grimaces of the possible human cost of the virus. The hard, declarative sentences he used were meant, I suppose, to show that he was levelling with the people, being frank, truthful, and direct. In practice, they actually made him sound increasingly cold and remote, distanced from the reality even as he measured its dimensions. He spoke in certainties of families losing loved ones before their time, and I felt my jaw tighten. How dare he speak in such blasé terms about other people's loved ones? How, I wondered, did he manage to speak with such offhand irreverence about cherished human lives? Lives like mothers. By the time the quarantine was officially announced, I had already moved in full-time with Mother. At first, she was typically grumpy about it, huffing and complaining loudly at every opportunity, as if having me there were a huge inconvenience or a restriction on her hard-won freedom. "Now you move in," she grumbled with a wave of the hand. "More reason to be outside." Despite this, I knew deep down that she appreciated me being there. That night, we watched the announcement together. Like most people I have spoken to about the whole thing, I have to admit that the apparent seriousness of the situation did make my stomach tighten, and I felt a familiar pang of fear. My mother, seeming to recognize the glint of fear in my eyes, rested her good hand on mine and squeezed. Then, with a level of acceptance and humility I was not expecting, I saw her nod her head as she whispered, "I stay in if you stay in. It will be okay. We have been inside together before." I threw her a smile, knowing that she was right on both counts. It would be okay, and we had, of course, been inside together before. I squeezed her hand back, careful not to squeeze too tightly and bruise her fragile skin. She caught me looking at her and turned her head away, sucking her teeth at the screen. "Why, this man is Boris. He is no Russian, this Boris." At this we both laughed, though we knew that the laughter was a curtain, a concealing shield held up to hide what lurked behind, what always lurked behind. For behind this veil of humour hung the memory of the last time we were inside together, and the real, horrifying reason why she never wanted to be inside again. I was 6 years old the day the sky fell down. At 6 years old, every day seems to last forever. Even an hour is like an age. In our tomb under the table, the days seemed even longer. But I still kept count. I was 6 years, 14 days by the time we finally got out. The earthquake struck on my 6th birthday. Minutes before it happened, the surface of the table had been laid with a fabulous spread of treats and even, wonder of wonders, a cake. I remember even then, at such a young age, looking at the collected goodies and noticing how out of place they seemed. Our home, before it was destroyed by the earthquake, was a sparse apartment on the bottom floor of a dilapidated building in one of the poorer quarters of Istanbul. It consisted of a single room, a dark concrete box with a single glassless window and walls the colour of autumn skies. The overwhelming impression given by the place was one of scarcity, the banality forced upon those that can afford no better and who live and die surrounded by the muted, grey palette of want. But not on my birthday. My mother was a proud woman, and no son of hers was going to see his birthday flash by as just another measure in a life of drudgery. A birthday, she insisted, should be special. On that day, my mother, having saved what meagre pittance she was able to earn, spent it in preparation. She laid the table with an array of cheap but brightly wrapped delights that seemed to us to leap from the grey like a glorious red tulip, growing, somehow, through a crack in the pavement. The meagre light afforded by our single window meant that much of the room was in a constant state of near darkness. The areas that were lit were illuminated ineffectively by my mother's old oil lamp, meaning that the walls around us seemed forever to dance with crowds of flickering shadows. Against that dull background, the suites looked incongruous, wrong, and out of place. Yet they filled my young mind with such excitement. It is a wonder to me now that at the time the wrappers themselves were as great a marvel as their contents. Colour was rare here, and a thing to be cherished. On a normal day these things were tantalizingly and tortuously out of reach. As it so happened, the earthquake ensured that they would remain that way. The strange thing about earthquakes, when they happen, is that for the first few seconds you wonder if the problem is with you, inside your head. Your mind struggles to come to terms with the fact that the horizon seems to be quivering, that the ground beneath you is shifting, and the walls are beginning to shake. In the fraction of a second it takes your mind to jump to the word earthquake and make sense of what is happening. Your thoughts spill into the blur created by the event. As a newly minted 6-year-old who had never before experienced an earthquake, I was terrified. My mother, having already reached the moment of epiphany that told her what was happening, gripped my arm with such force that the action left bruises, and with a single yanking motion dragged me from my chair heavily onto the floor and pulled me under the table. Seconds later, the chair in which I had been sitting was crushed by the internal wall, collapsing inward as the 2 floors above our dwelling caved in around us and everything went dark. Both my mother and sister screamed, but they were very different sounds. My sister's cry was of pure 4-year-old fear. My mother's was different, of pain. Mother's quick thinking, to drag us both, clutched to her chest beneath the table, had saved us from the falling building, but it had also sealed us in. Around us, on all 4 sides, huge slabs of rubble, concrete, brick, and dust stood in haphazard piles. They had fallen on top and around the table so that we were now enclosed within the cavity created by its dimensions. It was as if the room had shrunk, hammered from every side like a soda can being crushed in seconds to become 1/100th of its size. As if even the tiny patch we had been afforded in life was considered to be too much, and now the only space that God would allow us was the space beneath the table, the space in which we were now trapped. My mother's foot had been outside of that space, half of it protruding out beyond the ordained area of sanctuary. As such, that foot was punished. From the scream she had let out, I knew immediately that the foot had been crushed. The table itself was of heavy oak and had been the only piece of furniture in the room when we had moved in. It was a sturdy piece, which, like Atlas, was now holding what seemed like most of the building across its surface. The surface where only minutes earlier my birthday cake had been. I remember wondering how long the table's 4 legs could hold. The initial blackness that had come with the quake was disrupted now by a single shaft of light that spilt into the small space and gave me my first glimpse of my mother's agonized expression. Her face and hair, covered in a thick layer of dust cast out by the collapsing building, seemed to have been claimed by the grey, as if the walls themselves had reached out and taken her, absorbing her into themselves and making her one of their own. She caught my eye and, coughing furiously, winced as she tried to turn. Then she told me not to be scared, to show how brave I was, and to see if I could find the jar at the bottom by her feet. I shifted my hips back and forth, sometimes catching and sometimes slipping under the table ceiling, and managed as best I could to turn my body and slither past my mother and sister toward the bottom of our new rectangular abode. There, undamaged, was the large clay pot my mother always kept under the table, and which I knew was filled with water. "Is it okay, Samed?" my mother hissed, the act of speaking clearly causing her pain. Her voice had taken on a gravelly, tattered aspect that meant that when she spoke, her voice seemed to have more of a texture than sound. I answered that it was. Then she instructed me to use a spoon that lay by my knee to take 2 spoonfuls worth of water and drink it. I was then to give my sister the same measure, and if I could balance it, carefully bring 1 spoonful to her. I did as she asked. As I carefully crept with the spoon of water for Mother, she told me that this was now our most precious thing. "The important thing now," she said, wincing and screwing her eyes tightly shut with each word. "The most important thing for us is to be brave and to save as much water as we can. Soon they will come to find us. Then we will be safe. But until then, we need to stay here and be brave. You are a big boy now. I can't move, so you will need to look after the water for your sister. I need you to only take 2 spoonfuls, no more, and make sure your sister takes the same. Do you understand?" I nodded yes, and holding the handle as firmly as possible, poured the single spoon of water into my mother's mouth. The moisture, when it touched her lips, made them look black against the thick layer of grey dust that coated her face. Though I didn't realize it at the time, this rationing of our water supply would be essential to our surviving, and my mother was, even then, preparing for the long haul. I settled down beside her, determined that I would show her just how brave I could be. Night fell, and as it did, it dragged the temperature down with it. The space in which my mother, my sister, and I were trapped was around 6 feet long by 4 feet wide. From the tiled floor to the ceiling, formed by the underside of the table, was around 3 feet. My mother, laying on her side, 1 foot disappearing beneath a huge slab of rock, was pinned in place. My sister huddled up against her, affording me a few feet to move, and by sliding on my belly, to change directions. I could sit upright, without my head touching the ceiling, but could not move much more than that. The small gap through which light spilled was at the end where my mother's head rested, and appeared like the tiny entrance to an underground cave. It also seemed to be very far above us. As night came, I too huddled into my mother, but I did not sleep. Every few minutes my mother would let out a cry to whomever might be walking or searching above. From our tomb, we had no way of knowing how far the devastation had spread, how far we were from the surface, or whether anyone in the surrounding area was even still alive. Yet she did not give up hope, and instead cried over and over, hoping and praying that someone above would eventually hear us and begin to dig. That first night, I was hopeful, and a few times when my mother called, I called too, adding my voice in the hope that our rescuers would hear our cries. Nobody did. The second day, I awoke to find my mother asleep, and for a horrible second I feared that she had died. It was only when I saw my sister's head still gently rising and falling on my mother's chest that I realized she was still breathing. That day was incredibly long. With every unanswered call for help, my belief that an answer would come at all began to deplete, as if my belief was a statue, and each unheeded call a chip taken with hammer and chisel from the hole. My mother, however, continued to call. Around midday, my sister, who until that point had been uncharacteristically quiet, asked tentatively what we were going to eat. My mother did not answer until many hours later, and then only to me. My sister didn't ask again. When night fell and we had eaten nothing, she already had her answer. "We have water," my mother told me flatly once my sister was sleeping. "Enough to last." She sighed deeply and gritted her teeth as she tried to shift her weight. "It will be the hunger that finds us," she whispered finally. It was that phrase, "the hunger that will find us," that touched me. As the 3rd, 4th, and 5th days went by, the words came to haunt me. Something in the way my mother used the phrase, "the hunger," the way she applied the definite article to the concept, twisted it from meaning the empty feeling in my belly to something else entirely. It sculpted and moulded the hunger into a thing with form, a dark, shadowy thing with limbs and eyes that in my 6-year-old mind was prowling somewhere above us. A thing I knew that would eventually find us, and in a strange perversion of the word's meaning, would eventually eat us. When I look back now, decades later, I think, perhaps, that it was my mind's way of dealing with the trauma, distracting from the very real peril that all three of us were in, the danger of suffocation, starvation, of being crushed by inventing some creature, some hunting thing that I could be scared of, my fear given a shape. That night my mother continued to call, but I didn't help, for whilst I wanted more than anything to be found, for some hero to hear our calls, there was part of me that didn't think the hero would hear us, that thought maybe there was no hero at all, only the shadowy villain. I was reluctant to call out for fear of the hunger, scared to alert it to our hiding place to give the predator a scent of its prey. That night, when my mother finally succumbed to exhaustion and slept, I looked up at the small tunnel of light above and prayed that it would remain intact, that this disk of light far above, that for us was practically the sun, would not be eclipsed by a creature stalking slowly before it. With both my mother and sister asleep, and the cold of the floor tiles seeping with insidious slowness into my bones, I remained awake and alert, listening through the awful silence, over our muffled and laboured breathing, for movement. Movement above or to the side, fast or controlled and cautiously slow. I strained my ears, struggling to catch any shifting whisper of a something lighter than a shadow, stretching through gaps toward me. I pictured it, black, pulled and warped, malformed like the shadows that once danced on our walls that had fallen, collapsed, and yet still sealed us in. The air beneath the table became thick, heavy with stagnant breath, exhalations inhaled anew, hot and full, sodden with moisture but sparse on air. I began to breathe more quickly, gasping to feel a full breath, a clean, cool inhalation that would fill my lungs and nourish my body. Instead, the air seemed stale and empty. I felt a pressure, heavy as a lead weight, pushed down upon my chest as the walls of my prison, already so narrow, seemed even then to shrink. Perhaps, I thought, this was a tomb. Perhaps we were already dead, and the hunger would come like the worms of the grave to feed upon those below ground, because, after all, was that not what we now were? I looked again to the light, scouring its edges for a flicker of something, wrapped and enclosed even within the confines of this space in my own smaller, private hole. Terrified of something my mind had invented, and yet for which I now searched the horizon. Then, a sound. At first, it was quiet, like the subtle rising of a breeze through leaves, but then louder. It's coming, I thought, from above, directly above. I raised my head and glared at the underside of the table as something scratched against the surface above, as if trying to scrape, burrow, and claw its way through. How, I thought, when the rubble lay against the surface, could anything be up there, trying like a dog digging up a bone to root down through the table to the food that lay below? I felt my entire body stiffen. The scratching grew louder, and I knew it was not in my head. There was something up there. I curled myself small, tight into a ball, knowing even then that my mother, pinned as she was, would be powerless to help when it came to drag me away. The next day, I awoke with a gnawing emptiness inside of me. Despite my thirst, I still took only the prescribed amount from the jar and administered the same helping to my sister. I wondered how, being much larger than us, my mother was surviving on her meagre ration, and after some discussion she agreed to take a second spoonful. It had become increasingly hot within our tomb, and it occurred to me that none of us had needed to use the toilet since the earthquake days ago. Nothing came out, because nothing had gone in. I was about to question my mother about this when the thought was interrupted by a low, groaning sound to my left. The next thing I felt was my mother, once again gripping me, though this time by the collar and wrenching me backwards. There was a loud and shattering crack as one leg of the table, standing in the corner opposite my mother's head, collapsed. The surface of the table in that corner folded in. After a moment, the other leg on the same side imploded and a huge cloud of dust rose up. Our small rectangle of sanctuary had shrunk even further and was now a triangular wedge. As the dust cleared and I gazed at the space, now closed, where I had moments earlier been sitting, I felt a wave of biting nausea and fear. Not only for the version of myself that might not have moved so quickly, might not have, yet again, been rescued by my mother, but for the realization that had it been the other side of the table that had collapsed, my mother would be no more. A thing people do not discuss about starvation is the quiet it creates. Once it finishes with your fat reserves, when it begins to feast on the proteins and your muscles, it also chews upon your words, swallowing your desire to speak so that your voice, your very will to speak, simply vanishes, consumed by your hunger. After that second collapse, I did not speak or even move again for the rest of the day. Days passed exactly the same. I know that there must have been differences, that I must have endured each second, marked the time in some way, but after the 5th or 6th, they melted together, one the same as the next, and in the pit of my bowels the churning grip of emptiness continued to writhe like an eel. Still, I counted the nights, knowing that with each nightfall, it came closer to finding us. Again, the sounds above. Scratching at the surface of the table, just above our heads, the sound, I knew, of taloned hands, clawing, trying to break through, penetrate into this hideout, to find and consume whatever it found inside. I stared up at the light, the surface so far and high above as across its bright, angelic face, I saw something move. At that moment, shivering with cold, exhaustion, and fear, for the first time, I began to cry. My mother, woken by my sobs, gripped me tightly. "Don't worry, baby," she whispered softly. "I won't let it get you. I won't." Still, I didn't close my eyes or imagine how she could stop it, even if she wanted to. On what I thought was the 10th day, my sister would not awake. When she finally did, she would remain conscious for only a few minutes at a time. That night, my mother wrapped her arms around me again and promised, "I won't let it get you, Samed. Either of you. I swear that I won't." She paused, and after a long time, in a low voice that was almost a whisper, she said, "Remember this feeling, my boy, my darling love. This will be the last time I ever hold you like this." I did, and it was. 3 days later, the light above us grew. At first just a little, but then in large, greedy chunks. Light flooded through the gap and stung our eyes with its brightness. Voices could be heard, and I knew it was over. The moments of the rescue were a little like the first seconds of the earthquake, a strange, rubbery blur as my mind clawed through files and references to understand what was happening, eventually landing on the answer, we My mother, my sister, and I were free. Some will of course ask, if my mother survived, then why was that night, pinned on our sides, the last time she ever held me in her arms? The simple answer is, because it was the last time she was able to. When rescuers asked how my mother lost her arm, she spoke in tears of rats. How some rodent would have managed to creep into that space to feed upon a limb was never called into question, and my sister and I, grateful to be alive, would never have called her a liar. Some mothers will do anything to ensure the safety of their children. My mother ensured that the hunger didn't get us. She gave a part of herself to make sure we didn't starve, and we accepted it gladly. It was only years later that I realized the scratching I had heard, that I had thought was coming from above, was not the hunger trying to get in, but was in fact my mother, in feverish desperation, sharpening the edge of the spoon. This has been Shut In, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2020 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.